I'm absolutely delighted to now welcome all you guys to enjoy and watch Scottish trad jazz now and then.
It came to a stage where Sandy couldn't get a bass player. The guy whom he had as a bass player, he wasn't very good. Used to play with gloves on. And my friend Jimmy Gavin said, "Oh, you used to play the violin, didn't you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, double bass is just the same. So get one and you'll join the band." So I bought my bass, £20 it cost me. I've just got rid of it for a slightly larger sum of money than that. I won't say what, because it might embarrass the new owner if he sees it and it reminds him. So, and I was self-taught. I got a lot of help from Stan Gregg, who was the pianist with Sandy at the time, because he was a good pianist, and he gave me ideas for playing thirds and fifths and so on, you know.
And I had a brother that was 3 years older and a sister that was 7 years older. They both played jazz piano. They were both into Fats Waller and Art Tatum, and I was the youngest, and I didn't learn piano. I thought it was easier singing than it was trying to play piano. So he wrote a note home to my parents asking if he could take my brother and I to a jazz club in Glasgow to see this incredible clarinet player. And it was the Musicians' Union in Glasgow we went to. It was a Friday night, and it was Sandy Brown, who at that time was, you know, a really big name clarinet player from Edinburgh, but he was also the head acoustical engineer for the BBC. I had never heard live jazz, and I was totally blown away by this man. He was life-size, more larger than life, big beard, but when he played, he had this gland in his neck that used to swell out like a frog, you know, and it was like a bit like Dizzy Gillespie's cheeks that I now know, but it was just the way he blew, and I was blown away by this as my brother was, and that was the first jazz I'd heard live. And we'd heard things on albums, but you couldn't get albums over here then. So that was the first, and I was at this point folk singing. I was in a folk club in the school, and I did light opera, Gilbert and Sullivan. I took the main part in that for 2 years, but I'd gotten the jazz bug. And I played with my brother. He had a modern jazz quartet, piano, vibes, bass and drums, and we used to play in the University Union. It was called the Snug Bar, where all the couples used to go, and a lot of people will remember this. No microphone, it was acoustic, and they said to me, "You can't sing with us unless you sing like Ella Fitzgerald or Sarah Vaughan." And at 16, that was, I couldn't do that, so I just did the best I could. And one night, the band leader from the dance upstairs, which was a Dixieland band, came down. His name was Malky Ross, and he said, "How would you like to come up and sing with our band?" And I said, "Oh, I can't sing that stuff." And he said, "Everybody knows the Saints." And I said, "Oh, I know that." He said, "Well, come up and sing." I'd never used a microphone, and it was one of the ones they used to have at the BBC, you know, the big ones with the springs round it, and it was huge. And I nearly deafened everybody in the place. It was full, because I've got quite a loud voice. And that was my first, and I thought, this is so easy compared to, you know, trying to sing like Ella or Sarah.
I was so intrigued with the music, I thought, I'll take up the trumpet. But it was unfortunate I had an accident playing football, headed a guy's head and slagging my 2 front teeth. And they did tighten up, but not enough to play the trumpet. So I decided, well, I'll just go for the clarinet. And luckily, there was a teacher available. So I went along to a pawn shop and got a simple system clarinet for about £6 it was at that time. And even though it was high pitch, unfortunately, so I couldn't really play in a band. But anyway, I learned the rudiments from this guy. And also another student, pupil of this chap, he played the alto. He was more advanced, much better. He actually played, in a group. And he said to me, he says, no, I'm going to Glasgow for lessons to a guy called Derek Hawkins. Now, Derek played with a huge band, big dance band, English dance band, called Ted Heath. And Derek, unfortunately, had gone deaf. So he packed in the big band, came to Glasgow, and St Vincent Street, he got himself a studio. He repaired the instruments, he taught the instruments, the reeds, and he also sold instruments. So I went along and arranged that he would teach me. And he had a few clarinets because the simple system was no good, high pitched. So he gave me, or he sold me a Marigot clarinet, which I still have.
Violet, over to you.
I got into it because somebody lent me a jazz record. It was I Want a Girl, played by the Saints, which was a Manchester band, and I just thought it was wonderful. And after that, somebody else mentioned that Freddie Randall's band was coming, because I was in Glasgow at the time, and they were coming to, I think it was the St Andrews Hall. So we went there, and after that I got involved in what was called the Glasgow Rhythm Club, and that's where the Clyde Valley Stompers played every Sunday night, and there was a lot of jivers went there as well. So there was a whole scene all up and coming at that time on both sides of the country, really.
I remember speaking to Ronnie Ray saying, look, I've got this double bass. He says, look, Ray Brown bass tutor, just get it and work at it. And I did so. And then those other, aspects of playing, those different kind of classical things with bowing and all that. So when I was staying in Glasgow, I went for tuition for bowing and stuff. But you've got to, well, the way I was seeing it, you've got to kind of go a certain way. You can't cover everything. And so I kind of just stuck with the jazz thing. And in doing, as I said earlier, meeting Brian Kerry, we would practice together originally through Stirling, because he was through in Stirling. And we just worked through standards. A lot of Gershwin songs were used in the modern jazz world. Parker, Gillespie, Miles, all these people use these standard songs to write their own tunes on to a fantastic level. And we just kind of, you're listening to bebop, you're listening to that music and you think, gosh, that's a fantastic tune, let's try and get that one together. They're difficult, it's not easy. And so we'd play that kind of material, and Jack would be playing, and we'd knock together a band, and Bill Kyle started coming in different aspects, and Bill was very influential in putting Platform up and running with Jack, I think, at that time, and one or two others. So, there was these guys around, and we'd be playing, and you just keep working at it and working at it and working at it and playing gigs.
But to go back, oh yes, I did mention Jackie McFarlane. Jackie was he wasn't the world's greatest singer, but he was a great favourite with the crowd, a great personality. And he carried, in the days when it grew dark, after Sandy and went away and one thing another, and Archie, he humped his travelling compendium around to play records anywhere and everywhere. He would play jazz for people. One of his great pride was that he'd met Louis Armstrong when he played the Edinburgh Empire around about 1938 or something like that. He wasn't the world's greatest singer, but he was well liked, well admired. Certainly somebody that everybody remembers, and he's been dead 25 years, that's not bad. 25 minutes after I've gone, of me, they will say, who? Pubs were very busy. The great dancing was very popular here. The old Pally and all the different ones. Well, they've just dinged down the Pally, unfortunately. A friend of mine gave up and died when they did that. He met his wife there. Pretty near everybody met their wives there. I didn't, but pretty near everybody else did. So everybody liked to dance, and everybody went out to entertain because the houses were cold. Coal was expensive. You wouldn't know about it. Everybody had coal fires. I'm amazed the place didn't burn down off now. And yes, if you want to know the atmosphere of the place, it was probably nearer New Orleans in the turn of the century thing, because they had loads and loads of horses. Bags of horses in the streets, so the breweries and all sorts ran them. Nobody, of course, had motor cars. If you could afford to buy a second-hand bike, you were doing very well. Buying an instrument took you a long time to get the money for that. Buying a bike did as well.
Well, there weren't very many piano players, quite a number of singers. I never felt there was any sort of prejudice. It was more difficult, I would say, because most of the bands were made up of men, so you had to be able to adapt to what they wanted you to do in terms of playing, etc.
None of the gigs had pianos anyway, did they?
No, it was very difficult, because all
buy
the pubs were getting rid of pianos at that time. So eventually, to stay playing, I had to buy my own piano. So I bought a second-hand upright for a gig that we had down in called the Spider's Web at the foot of Morrison Street. And I can't remember the exact circumstances, but I remember getting a phone call one day and say, your piano's been pushed down the stairs, it's broken. And I had paid £150 for this piano, so I said, well, you'll have to get the money back from him. Eventually I got the money back from the guy. He'd done it in he was quite drunk, I think, and he just pushed the piano. It was at the top of the stairs.
Could have killed somebody. Mm.
But we called ourselves the Stark Busby Jazz Band. Or Jazzmen, the Stark Busby Jazzmen. And unfortunate, the order of the names, because being Glasgow, we'd only played for a couple of weeks. And this guy that I knew came up to me and said, he says, how's the Stark Naked Busby Men getting on?
The Oddfellows Hall, which was a Victorian establishment with iron pillars holding up the balcony, and there was nothing on the floor, just the floor. When you danced, the clouds of dust came up, and it really hadn't changed much since it was used for Bible meetings and God knows what. And you paid your money, and on the way up the entrance, which was a long sort of place with a concrete floor, they'd always have a couple of bouncers, just in case. There was seldom the trouble you get now. Nobody pulled anybody pulling a knife. Anybody who jumped on got the police. They wouldn't have messed about. But you got the odd fights and things like that. People who come for trouble, not jazz fans. And amongst one of the bouncers was, of course, that well-known man, Mr. Thomas Sean Connery. And contrary to beliefs that he let somebody else do the bouncing, he was quite capable of doing it. He was a big, tough man. And yes, it's very nice to go to a jazz band ball in the Dickensian, some turn of the century meeting hall, and find that outside was somebody who became a world famous actor, bouncing people who didn't behave themselves. Yes, it was good fun. There was no license, of course. Then, of course, there was the jazz club, which we ran, the Condon Club, named after Indy Condon. And that was at the top of Victoria Street in the India buildings. Now, you walked up about 4 or 5 flights of stairs. And there was no license, of course. My wife and various others ran the little canteen thing. You got cups of coffee, tamp, and that's not a I meant canned coffee, and tea, and non-alcoholic fizz, and they all sat. The lucky ones had chairs, the old dining room chair, and the other ones sat in forms. There was no dancing, and you paid your money. I've still got the one of the posters hanging in my hall, and the Condon Club every Sunday, etc., etc. And the annual membership was 5 shillings, equivalent today to opposed to about, I don't know, 20 quid or something like that, which is neither here nor there. But 5 bob was a lot harder to find than 20 quid is now. And we used to go and listen to that. That is where Jackie came into his own. He was a great compere. And on the other side of Victoria Street, there was a Bible study place used to be there. And in these days, they took it very seriously. And at regular intervals, the caretaker would come up and say, "I've got them across again." And they turned up, you see, and they'd be saying, "You're playing that devil's music again." And Jackie used to go down and give them a long lecture about, no, it wasn't. The point was this was freeing the slaves' music, you see, and how blah, and he'd give them a little chat. And he had to do this about once a month. And they'd say, "Oh, well, we understand now, that's all right." That was for about 4 weeks, and they didn't understand. He started all over again.
Who could I say? Yes, playing with Sonny Stitt. Sonny Stitt came over in the early 80s, I believe. And I was asked to play with him in Dundee. And that was really interesting because, Sonny walked in, Stetson hat, camel coat, camel suit, cowboy boots with his trousers tucked into the cowboy boots, tenor, alto, put him down. We had a quick top and tail rehearsal. Then the other two, Kenny Fraser, the piano player, and Jimmy Lyons, they left. I went to the dressing room. Sonny came to the dressing room, said, "Okay, kid, what do you want to play?" And now you're talking about a guy who, I'd seen in London in, again, this whole rock thing. I'd seen him in something like 1973 playing with Dizzy, Art Blakey, Thelonious Monk, Al McKibben on bass, Kai Winding on the trombone, Stitt. Fantastic gig, absolutely fantastic gig in London. So here we are 10 years later and Sonny Stitt sitting there, and I said, well, I'm thinking, goodness gracious, how's about Gone with the Wind? Okay, takes the tenor out, okay, what else? And I said, well, he said, a ballad. And I said, well, what's new? Okay. And then I said, how's about, I thought, well, I've got to ask him to play Cherokee. And he looked at me and he said, I think he was kind of thinking about the rehearsal, and he sort of thought, well, maybe not tonight, But he was a lovely guy. It was just quite interesting just looking at him,
Well, Alex Shaw, of course. Alex Shaw was quite simply the best pianist around. And the reason that Edinburgh has so many good pianists in it is because of Alex Shaw. They had him to actually aspire to. And I'm a strong believer in this. It's the same basis. Ronnie Ray established standards for bass playing, and there's a load of others who are just doing their best to copy him or to emulate him at least.
Well, I'm very lucky in the sense that I've been here a long time, and a lot of the audience I know is the audience that I got to know when I came here, and they've always been very supportive, and I've never ever said thank you now, but and they still come along to my gigs, even though at one time it was only £1.50 to get in. Now it's 10, But they're always there, and I'm very lucky in that sense. That makes me feel that it's all been worthwhile, because the worst thing in the world is to be at my age and go and do a gig and there's no one there. so the audience to me are very, very important. And when I'm not playing and I meet them somewhere, we're like friends. And you know, without them, I couldn't do my music. You know, and I've come a long way from the moment when I was a kid and I wanted to do my own thing, and I couldn't care less what people thought about me. You know, so I've done that journey now, and I wouldn't advise any young kids to. Yes, I would. Yes, I would. You have to do your own thing. In jazz, you have to do your own thing. And you're not going to get rich. You're not going to, you know, as long as you get by and you're happy within yourself, that's the main thing.
We used to play at the Cavern in Liverpool, and the Beatles were our interval group. That's with the Stompers. They used to come, and, you know, I used to say, these four wee boys, you know, don't they know that Beatle means beastie? You know, they've got to change their name. They were awful nice, you know. And and then we came back the next time, and there was this huge crowd outside the Cavern. And I'm saying, gosh, somebody must have put some more publicity out, because it's really, and they were all kids. And we didn't realise that they were coming here to see the interval group. But they actually got on, they liked what we did as well, so it was, you know. But I think the Beatles, then the Rolling Stones, that changed it all. You know, that changed it for the jazz musicians.
When I was playing with the Brown Band, they were very like Louis' Hot Five. Al played like a copy of Louis, and Sandy was very much Johnny Dodds. But after they moved to London, they both changed gradually, going away from their original role models and really developing their own style and way of playing. I heard Ray Brown, and that was it for me, you know. I've never heard anything like it. I put it, if you talk in football terms, he was in the first division and I was down about the third division, you know. And never would I get up there, but you can worship your idols. His playing is just so challenging and, you know, fills you with enthusiasm for playing.
Well, so my first kind of leap in the music business was probably when I recorded my first album, which was Twilight Dreams, and it had again, it was John Ray and it was Julian Arguelles on saxophone, Brian Shields on bass, and Dave Milligan on piano. And the first several tunes that I wrote for that, they were all kind of really straightforward jazz tunes. You know, there was a blues there, kind of a couple of standard-y type sequences. There was a funky 60s sort of thing. But there was a couple of ditties that I'd written that they were far more folk influenced. I don't know where they came from, but just definitely had a Scottish lilt. And I didn't think they were going to amount to anything. I thought they were really poor, but actually they were far more interesting than any of the other things that I was writing. And that was the stuff that all the reviewers were attached and started talking about as being interesting. And I thought, well, okay, in that case, I'll keep on going down this avenue. So for my second album, which was A Journey Home, it was pure Scottish. It was absolutely, I was unrepentant in the use of any folky melodies. I think it was very original, and it was all original melodies. But and at the time, I was imagining writing for flute and for violin and for bagpipes. But then obviously we were playing it with a traditional jazz quintet, and it just seemed to have its own voice. And it seemed to go down well, and and things definitely looked up from then. There were lots of awards and amazing reviews and stuff. So
one of the memories I'll never forget was we were playing some gig somewhere north of Edinburgh. I can't even remember where. But also, we were accompanying very much on the bill the band, Alex Welsh's band, which had in it at that time Lenny Hastings, the great Lenny Hastings, who I'd never heard in the flesh. at that point. And Lenny Hastings was in a car. They had two cars, and the car he was in with, I forget who else, was delayed. And Alex came up and asked me, would you like to play with the band for a little while till Lenny gets here? This is me, Alex Welsh. That's a big jump. So I did, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And then Lenny had set his kit up behind the stage, behind the curtain on the stage. And I was told at the end of this number, you'll be moving your kit back, and Lenny will bring his kit forward. Won't take long. And he did. And I had to sit there, taking my drum kit apart quietly, listening to this man playing the drums like I just didn't believe was possible. I was the equivalent of the man who had to paint the skirting boards in the Sistine Chapel. It was just chalk and cheese. Lenny was just something else. He was nuts as well, mind you, but he was unbelievable player.
The Lewis Band had a concert in Manchester, and the next gig was in Glasgow, but there was no direct flights, so they came to Edinburgh for some reason and stayed overnight in the Carlton, and they were at a loose end, and Jim Young, our bass player, said, I'm going to sort something out. So we had a party at his cellar, which was a jazz club actually, and we actually played with all these guys, our heroes, incredible.
But with a few good laughs, Charlie wasn't there. He was some guy, Charlie. Remember, I was doing a gig with him in a hotel down the Cowgate, a pub down the Cowgate, and Charlie had problems with his prostate at that time, and he had the colostomy bag. So he said, okay guys, you ready? We're playing this number. And he went, squelch, 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 on purpose. And of course, the whole place folded up. The band couldn't play. It was incredible, really. Another time, Charlie, it was an Edinburgh Festival, I can't remember, years ago. And he announced that he was going to do I'm Confessing, but he was going to do it in Czechoslovakia. And his accent, I mean, it was a load of rubbish, but his accent was fantastic. And of course, it was really funny. And again, the whole place collapsed with laughter. Charlie, he was like that. He was some guy.
And when we got to the gig, we did it, and I'm singing away on a huge stage and mobbed, and I looked over to the left and there was two guys standing, very, very black, and long coats on and big hats, and I'm looking and I'm thinking, and they didn't look very happy. And I thought, oh. So when I came off, one of them came up to me and he said, I'm the doc. Pops wants to see you in the dressing room. And I thought, what was I, 18 or something? I thought, oh, I've done something wrong. Well, maybe sung one of his songs and I should, So I got taken down to this dressing room and it was huge, long dressing room with lights all the way down. And there was this wee man sitting right in the corner with his feet in a bucket and a hanky on his head with 4 knots in the hanky. And this smile that went to there. And I went up, and he said, I'm walking the whole length of this dressing room, and he said, I just came to see who was singing up a storm. He didn't actually say storm, he used something ruder, and I thought he meant that it was terrible. And I was sort of saying, oh, I'm really sorry, should I not have? And he said, where are you from? And I said, Portancapel. And he says, where's that? I said, Scotland. And he says, Scotland. Yes, no voices like that should come out of Scotland.
So let's now have just brief introductions for everyone. Just say whatever you want to say, talk about anything you might be doing at the moment, and then we're going to get into talking about traditional jazz of the past. So, Mr. Lee, have you anything you wish to offer?
Oh, just to introduce myself. I got here in 1980 to Edinburgh after doing a lot of prog rock. And got into jazz as soon as I got here. I was always been into jazz and was lucky enough to join Swing 80. Was that with that band for ages and picked up a lot of trad jazz, traditional jazz along the way, playing with other people.
Fantastic. Mr. Ken Matheson.
Hi there. I used to be a sort of a jazz drummer, but I think I've been retired. I don't remember getting the letter about it, but suddenly the phone stopped ringing. It had been a long, slow decline over many decades, I have to say, but then it suddenly went dead. We checked all the connections. The phone still seems to be connected, but the outside world isn't. So that kind of sums up where I am now.
Graham, would you like to tell us about yourself a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I started in skiffle music in the 1950s, and then, like Lenny, I got into the jazz scene in 1959, played with well-known Edinburgh bands like Old Bailey and his Jazz Advocates, the Louisiana Ragtime Band, New Society Syncopators, and the Spirits of Rhythm. For the last 34 years, I've been running a four-piece band on a cruise boat in the Forth. Still playing, but not during the lockdown, of course. And as you said, I wrote a book 10 years ago about Edinburgh jazz. And I've always been a habitual keeper of notes and scrapbooks.
That's perfect. And Beverly?
Me, hello. I came through to Edinburgh as a student from Dundee, as a student to do music, study music. And it was through that I eventually heard bands in Edinburgh and got to know people. And I'm a brass player, but I picked up the banjo and was lucky enough to just get the jazz scene in Edinburgh at the time. I'm talking about the mid-80s, the early to mid-80s, when I got into the jazz. And you were tripping over jazz bands at the time. So I managed to get into the bands and played and never looked back, actually. Loved it and thought, this is it. This is what I want, you know.
Fantastic. We got you. It says Thomas there on your thing. Lenny?
It does say Thomas because Thomas is my first name. Yes. I started with the George Penman Band back in the days in Wednesday Town Hall in 1959 when I was 18 years old. There we are. And I think I've managed to play with everybody that you've got in this Zoom setup.
Yeah.
At some point or other, I have played with them all. And of course, still active up until March so far with the Roy and the quartet.
You forgot the High Society Band in Paisley before George Penman.
Of course, I forgot Kenny. Kenny is, apart from being the best drummer I've ever played against, he's a fellow Paisley buddy. Yes.
Hello?
I'm Larry Thompson. The only thing I can play is a gramophone, and I don't even play that very often. But I've been involved in jazz in Edinburgh since the early 1980s, and I think I've heard everybody here playing in one format or another.
Yeah.
I suppose my great claim to fame is being the joint founder of the Edinburgh Jazz and Jive Club, which this year celebrates its 20th anniversary.
So, Paddy, introduce yourself, please.
Hello, I'm Paddy. I came to Edinburgh for university in 2008 and then left for a bit when I'd finished. Came back. I was playing in a lot of funk and pop bands in town, and a late night lock-in at the jazz bar, I got chatting to some of the guys in the band about my love of traditional jazz musics and stuff like that, and they all seemed keen to give it a go. So I started the Tenement Jazz Band in 2018, and yeah, I've sort of trying to share my love of the older music with my pals who don't really know anything about it, but are all very keen to play. So
Excellent. And Dr. Freud, have you anything you wish to?
Yes, I have some words. No, my name's Roy Percy. I came to Edinburgh, or the Edinburgh area, in 1980 as a schoolboy, believe it or not, and played in jazz bands, jazz band in the school. Met Dick Lee actually in about 1982 or 3 when he was playing with Swing 82 or 3 at the school, and determined, strangely, that would do for me. So I continued playing and then met up with Dick again in the mid-80s, where I was, about that time, I was playing in a university Dixieland band. I was not at the university, but I was part of that band, and met Beverly Knight there, and she played with us for one of the competitions. The Jazz Festival used to have youth jazz competitions. It was the Avis We Try Harder Award. And I think yes, I think that was Avis's motto at the time. But
No, it was Judge Jeffrey's motto.
Judge Jeffrey's.
Fantastic. So now everyone is acquainted, even though you're already acquainted. So I figure we could start off talking about some of the earliest trad jazz concerts and memories that we have here throughout Scotland, not just in Edinburgh.
There were jazz activities in the pre-war years, the 20s and 30s, but not very much of it. But in the 40s, there were rhythm clubs, which didn't at first present live jazz, but they presented record recitals, sometimes devoted to a single musician. But gradually, jam sessions started to appear and played a bit in the rhythm club sessions. And then the so-called revival gave the whole thing tremendous impetus. And by the mid-40s, a lot of people were actively playing jazz. But it would be wrong to talk about concerts at that time. They were playing in clubs and sometimes in pubs. And I don't know, Lenny can tell you about what happened in Glasgow, or Ken can, but in Edinburgh, time after time, the clubs were closed down by the police, who toured around checking that they were being properly run, but probably what they were looking for was illicit drink and drugs. But,
if I can comment, sorry, Graham, if I can comment on the Glasgow scene, my earliest recollection, and Kenny will remember this as well, is playing to a packed audience of 2,500 in St Andrews Halls in jazz competitions, which were organised by either the Evening Times or the Evening Citizen, and probably both. But anyway, we played to 2,500 people, and my recollection is we were paid £3 a man. Is that right, Kenny?
Something like that. Something. It certainly bought you quite a lot of drink. I can remember that bit. Yeah, those were amazing competitions, because all the bands in Glasgow of any kind of half decent standing were all corralled into the one hall and the one huge dressing room. So it was a fantastic social night behind the scenes, as well as a cutthroat competition. Yeah. The problem with those things was that the panel of judges consisted of no musicians whatsoever. The results were always highly contested after the event. But I can remember before that, before any of those, I can remember when I was still at school, getting on my bike one day and cycling from Paisley up to Bellahouston Park because I'd spotted in the paper that the Clyde Valley Stompers would be playing. And when I got there, this would be about 1957 or 58, and Maurice Rose was on soprano sax. And I can remember seeing, now this is probably not the last time you'll hear this name, Maurice Rose, but Maurice was a strange looking child about 2 years older than me, playing with this bunch of hooligans in the Clyde Valley Stompers. And he was absolutely amazing, absolutely amazing. I came away from that, and that was the one thing I really remember about it, was what an amazing saxophone player that guy was, soprano sax, and he played clarinet as well. The Glasgow Herald in recent years has been doing a wee photo montage of things from their archive, and they produced a photograph of the Clyde Valley Stompers on a riverboat shuffle on the deck of one of the steamers on the Clyde. And it had, among others, lots of people whose names have long since passed our ken, like Dean Kerr on trumpet, great trumpet player who died young. But Maurice is there, and it's the last known photograph, last known sighting by anyone ever of Maurice with polished shoes, tidily dressed, combed hair, and his saxophone was glistening in the sunlight. I mean, this has never happened. Nobody recognises him at all when you see the photograph. You think that all looks a bit like Maurice, but not as I remember him.
Something from one of my memory of might have been the first jazz festival I played in here, which was very exciting times, having just got into a band and playing traditional jazz for the first time ever. And then I found myself in the Last Drop Tavern in the Grassmarket, playing with Benny Waters. And I just about, if I could play well at all, then I certainly didn't on that occasion, because he was just so kind of wonderful and intimidating. And I had this sort of Royal Leamington Spa kind of clarinet squeaking sound. Next to me there was this roaring tenor, and so I thought I've got a bit of learning to do here.
Those earlier Edinburgh Jazz Festivals were good from the point of view of mixing musicians and bands and punters up, because they'd be touring around the city playing maybe half a dozen gigs in a day, often with different bands every gig, in different lineups.
Well, the early festivals were nearly all traditional jazz, and they were in pubs. It was the pub trail, they called it.
And I can remember working with a cornet player from America called Dave Pinardi, and we worked for a week with Dave, and Lindsay Cooper was the bass player, and Jack Duff played tenor on it. And it was a gorgeous little band. There must have been somebody playing chords somewhere. I can't remember now offhand who that might have been. It might
Tom Finlay. It was Tom Finlay.
Oh, wow.
Yes. And it was a lovely little band. And Dave was such a good player, and yet that's a name that arrived out of the blue and then disappeared back into the blue. Nobody's ever heard of him.
The days of the jazz festival, when the bands mixed up, there was always some famous person playing with one of the local bands and so on. And I thought that was great, so that sort of thing would be great, if we could get something like that again,
That's always been a massively popular idea for everyone, because the local musicians get the benefit of playing with somebody famous, and they enjoy that. And the local audiences who are maybe not familiar with the visiting artist, but are familiar with the local band, they go and see their local band because it's their favorite local band, and they get to hear this great player. And then there's an audience who are only going to see the great player and don't know anything about the local band, and they get to hear a really good local band almost by mistake, you know.
Yeah.
And I think,
Yeah.
and also it's quite cheap.
Yes.
Can I ask, actually? So I've got a video here, which I'd like to share with you of the 1984 Jazz Festival. It's
1984. Good heavens.
right.
If you've got Hamish, I'm hiding behind a drum kit and a hat, hoping nobody recognises me.
It's playing.
And I'm hoping you can kind of hear it.
Oh.
I remember it well.
Yeah.
It's a bit jittery. There's naked people.
Yes,
Graham Lamar.
Graham.
Kenny Milne, Ed Burke, Bob Craig.
There's Hamish.
Tom Finlay. Tom Finlay.
Oh wow!
Sorry? That was
Yes.
the year it was sunny.
It's sunny.
Throughout the entire history of the Jazz Festival starting parades, every single parade was in good weather,
Yeah.
almost unbelievably.
Well,
Wow.
if anybody wants a copy of that DVD, get in touch with me and I'll give you a copy.
Fantastic. What a wonderful thing to have in the archives. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we could have something like that again? It's so much joy there.
Sorry, are you able to edit it so that Hamish McGregor's bare chest isn't in the one I get?
And who would you think? Who do you think are the biggest sort of success stories from Scotland in tradition?
Alex Welsh. The 1940s produced a famous generation of jazz musicians that many of whom went on to make a career in jazz.
Mm.
Sandy Byrne, Al Fairweather, Stan Gregg,
Alex Welsh,
Alex Welsh,
Archie Semple,
yeah,
Archie Semple,
Corey Cairns in Glasgow. These guys were absolutely the top of the heap.
Stan Gregg.
And made international reputations. And they unfortunately, in those days, to be successful, you had to move south to a London base to work full time. So nearly all of these guys disappeared south. But that, you know, there were some very high class jazz musicians amongst that crowd.
What lessons? I mean, what sort of things can younger players? You know, and Beverly, what do you have any thoughts on that? And particularly as a woman, so there still is. It is obviously very male dominated, as it traditionally always has been. So, as a woman, how have you found
At
playing?
first, it was a bit funny because I'll tell you the best person was Charlie McNair. I played a lot of gigs with Charlie McNair, and excuse me, he was great because you would get guys coming up going, "Oh, you know, that's a rare band, a rare woman you've got in the banjo." And Charlie would say, "No, the only reason she's in the band is because she's a good banjo player. It's nothing to do with her being a woman, you know." And he used to always stand up for me and in that sort of way, which was great. I mean, that's a way back many, many years ago, you know.
I got together some women who I said, "Are you interested in giving this a go?" And none of them had played jazz or traditional, certainly not anything traditional, even though we're not technically a traditional jazz band. It is early jazz. So we got together and they're loving it. They absolutely love it. And whenever we play, we get a huge response, not just because it's, you know, 6 women playing early music, but people are very interested in that style. As again, it's early jazz, not traditional jazz. So that was something that started, and we've got a huge following now, and it's quite exciting.
But I found as a music teacher, talking about youngsters, there was no incentive for kids to play traditional jazz in the school. Fine, I tried way back, I don't know, probably in the late 80s, 90s. I started with jazz bands to get the kids involved. But it's very difficult because it's easier for the schools to have bigger bands because you've got more kids together, and it shows, you can put them up in the school concert as, 20 kids playing together instead of 5 or 4 or 6. And it's easier, and the time constraints to try and have lots of little jazz bands and instrumentation and so on. So I think if you got more people going into the schools and talk, because they're not hearing it, they're not hearing the music anywhere, they're not seeing it anywhere on the telly, or so all they're getting is rock music or pop music or whatever they're listening to.
It didn't keep.
I think in schools, they very often, as Beverly was saying, you can have a big band, or you can maybe have a little Dixieland band, and you can do some little arrangements that the children read. The problem always arrives in a jazz band setting, particularly when it comes to individual solos, improvisation. And teaching improvisation is something that, it's one thing to have a little program of listening to a visiting jazz band and inspiring the children, which is a wonderful thing. And the little that was done, I think, was great. It should be more of that. But to actually teach improvisation is something that's way beyond the remit of most, I would say, that your average or normal music teacher in a school. And they wouldn't be expected to be able to do that and teach the children. Teach the children that. And I think that's a big stumbling block, because they can sound like a nice little jazz band for a few minutes, and then the soloing begins, and they're very self-consciously struggling with it, as we all do still.
Taking out traditional jazz right from the start,
Well, when they teach jazz in college, I don't think the jazz they teach starts much before 1950 or 55. Am I wrong? I'm not claiming to know about these things, but that's what I hear.
You're quite right, but you've got to watch. You can start comparing apples and pears here.
Yeah.
The school's teaching system, and Bev knows far more about this than I do, it always seems to me that it is preparing people for what is basically orchestral music. They produce people with good techniques, good reading skills, who can slot in as a unit. But what Roy said is absolutely right. The improvisation part of it is much more difficult to teach.
Yeah.
The other thing there's two other factors. One is that a vast number of the traditional jazz musicians were self-taught.
Yeah.
And a lot of gain came from that in terms of the characteristics of the individual. But how you would bring these together, I don't think, I'm pessimistic. If we're talking about traditional jazz, I think it will only survive as a curiosity, almost as a museum piece.
A chamber music.
Sorry?
It's chamber music.
Yeah, that's right.
People will go and listen to and study in a concert.
But there's another aspect to what you're saying, and that is that it'll never actually go away, because if you're going to play any kind of music well, you have to start with good musicians who are looking for a challenge. Now, there's a parallel here with klezmer music. It had gone from Europe, its homeland, and it got revived by kids in the States, recognizing that you actually have to be able to play your instrument to play it properly and be in the idiom.
Yeah,
I think they need to listen to the music. They need to hear it, and they're not hearing it.
Yes, that's right.
It's just not on the telly or the radio or that. They're just not hearing the music. Whereas years ago, it used to be, I remember as a kid listening to the wireless, and you got such a mixture of music, and jazz was part of it. And, you never thought anything of it, jazz or classical or pop, the pop music of the day. But nowadays, you just don't. Everything is in boxes now, and you don't hear it. And that's half the problem as well. If a lot of these kids heard the music, they might think, oh, hey, that's something I would like to get involved in,
Optimistic, yes.
What Beverly was saying is absolutely right. Kids are not hearing the sort of jazz that we're talking about. But
exactly.
I would go a stage further than that. They're not seeing the bands live.
Yeah.
It's not just on the media it's lacking. They're not seeing the bands. If I wanted to try and encourage youngsters to play traditional jazz, I would take a traditional band into the schools.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
See and hear a band playing.
Yeah.
My generation, that's where we all came from.
Yeah.
Can I ask Roy a question? Because Roy he's the youth wing of the band I play in.
This shows how old they are.
Well, Roy's the same age as my eldest son. So, but I wonder where others of Roy's age, where did they go? If you were interested in that kind of music, where is the rest of that age group? Where have they gone?
Yeah, well, I think I really don't know what happened there. I think I was maybe the odd one out, along with a handful of other people. But yeah, I don't know what the arts or culturally what my generation do go and see and do. I'm not really sure what goes on. If you look at Facebook, it seems to mostly be, I don't know, nice holidays and trips to the theatre and all good things. But I don't know why these things happen.
Well, the truth of the matter was there weren't many of them by that time, Roy. As each succeeding generation, there's been fewer and fewer people getting interested in the more traditional forms of jazz. We mentioned earlier, the word trad picked up a derogatory meaning as well.
Yeah.
Traddy pop. But there were good things about that as well. The so-called trad boom, where there was the funny hats and the uniforms and daftness going on, nonetheless produced a lot of people who came in and stayed with the music. But they were attracted by something that was in the public eye.
Yeah.
And they decided, I wouldn't mind a bit of that. And then find a way of doing that.
Yes.
Something that I thought might help, but I mean, is that something we should do more of? Should we have more, I would say, bars, restaurants, general, try and get out there more to be seen? What do you think?
There's a huge lack of venues. Kenny will have something to say about this because he knows about it. But there's very few places. You talk about the Jazz Bar, and the Jazz and Jive Club was formed because the venues had all disappeared. In the 1980s, largely given impetus by the Jazz Festival, there were 49 separate jazz presentations, if you like, gigs a week in all free and in pubs.
Yeah. Paddy, what do you think? What are your thoughts on this as one of the sort of the younger?
Well, Tenement started out, in order to get gigs, we just put gigs on, and we didn't charge for people to come in the hope that people would hear. What happened when we were putting them on was people would hear the music from outside and come in because it's such a joyful form of music. How could anybody avoid but be pulled in? So I found us actually doing it for no money and then telling people the situation at the venue, just saying, we're doing this because we love it, and the bar can't afford to pay us because they're taking a chance on having us come in, and there is not really a traditional jazz scene anymore. So, and asking people for donations, telling them the facts of the situation, that is, we are professional musicians and we are doing this gig because we want to play this music, and we will continue to do it if you give us money. And people would often pay more in donations. So rather than charging up front, we allowed people to come in to listen for no money and then ask for donations. And that kind of, yeah, I mean, it's not exactly a great way to build a sort of professional career, but it does help build interest from people who have no reason to be interested in your music. They've never heard it before. They've no idea what it is you do. Like, you get people coming into their gigs and saying, like, what is this music? And you're like, well, it's traditional jazz. And they're like, but I don't like jazz. Like, why do I like this musical form that people haven't been exposed to? Like, Bella, you were saying before, like, that I'm trying to do things with my band, like going busking, and doing these gigs where we're not having a cover for getting in, but asking for donations, which stops there being a barrier to entry monetarily for people who have no reason to seek out what you're doing because they don't know it exists. What we're trying to do is do the music anyway and hope we build interest, and from that we can hope that people will remember that traditional jazz exists. So
See, there's surely lessons to be learned from the Scottish traditional folk scene, because it wasn't thriving in the 60s because of the trad boom and then the Beatles, like everything else. But they've managed to revive that, and one of the routes they've gone down is to set up teaching schools or as centres of excellence. I'm thinking about Plockton High School as one of them, where Dougie Pincock ran. I don't know if he's still there or not, but he ran the traditional music course there for years. And it was like a conveyor belt of pipers and singers and multi-instrumentalists coming out of the Plockton High School. So they've addressed it, and it seems to be a more thriving scene. I think it's probably better remunerated as well than the traditional jazz scene has become, because in playing traditional jazz in pubs, you're still getting the same money as you got about approximately 1985 to 1990 from the few I've played recently, because it's kind of hardly worthwhile going out.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Roy Williams talks about going from Watford, where he stays, Luton, where he stays, into London to play for 25 quid in a pub.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Because it's the only way he can keep playing the trombone. If he stops playing, the chops go, and then he gets the phone call for a 300 quid gig, and he can't play. So he's got to go and do all of these silly gigs, and it's just about, how do you do it? The venues won't be able to pay the money.
Lenny will know much more about the Glasgow part of it than I do, but in Edinburgh, the generation of jazzers I went out to listen to in the 50s and into the 60s were playing virtually for nothing. They were nearly all hobby musicians.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd have a job getting pubs to host bands if they were having to pay a lot of money to pay the band.
Has anyone got, and Dad, any closing thoughts on how things could proceed?
Well, my closing thought would be that it needs people from Ali's and Paddy's generation who would be prepared to continue to run something like the Jazz and Jive Club or George Hewitt's session through in Irvine. Because if there's no venues, there's nowhere for people to play.
Yeah. Any other thoughts from anybody?
The Edinburgh Festival should talk once again to Rebecca Kilgore. She used to come to the festival on a semi-regular basis, going back maybe 10, 15 years, and she is an outstandingly good singer with a colossal repertoire.
Fantastic.
Nice lady to work with. She's a musician. She's a guitarist as well. So
good rhythm guitarist.
What about Cecile?
Well, Cecile Salvo. I don't think anybody can afford her anymore.
I know.
No.
But she performed a few years back. I remember she was at the Piccolo, and I went along to see that. Yeah, I think she's probably out of the budget now. She's yeah,
absolute knockout, and a lovely lady to work with. As Rebecca. Another one who came to the festival years ago was Topsy Chapman, and she was terrific.
She's
Blues
great.
and gospel singer. Great stuff.
Yeah, it'd be nice to have them back.
I think, given the way the music market is nowadays, it's much easier to sell jazz through a vocal connection than it is strict instrumental stuff.
Very true.
And those are people who can definitely do it. They can sing, and they are great musicians in their own right. There's an aspect to something that Roy was talking about, and that is that, if you've got musicians who have got music in them, and they play with somebody of undoubted better quality, real top of the tree players, these top of the tree players will pull the local musicians into areas they couldn't have imagined they would get into.
Yeah.
And it's so beneficial to the musicians to get the exposure to that. The danger is you get a gross mismatch of abilities or stylistic clashes and all the rest of it, and you get Sweets Edison complaining about the rhythm section being booked that morning from Yellow Pages. That happened. I don't know who the rhythm section was, but I heard about it. And I mean, that's definitely has been this part of the experience of the Edinburgh Festival down the years. There's always the Yellow Pages problem as well, but if it's done sensibly, sensible matches, then it's beneficial for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. What about Roy? Roy, what do you think? Who would you like to have come up and bring Rico back?
Yeah, Rico Tommaso, Duke Heiger, Evan Christopher, any of those guys is fine by me.
Yeah.
I loved it all. George Washing Machine.
George Washing
Remember
Machine.
George? George. Stephen Washington. Oh, I've given away his real name. George Washing Machine. He was just such a performer, and so much fun and high quality. Great, super. He lives in Australia, unfortunately, so it's a bit far to come.
Can I tell you a real story about on the theme of importing star performers? Some years ago, Mike Hart decided that he was going to have an all-star front line at the Edinburgh Jazz Festival, and he had Lenny Herd, Forrie Cairns, and the trombone player Roy Williams. And the bill was put up in that order: Lenny Herd, Forrie Cairns, and Roy Williams. And I spoke to someone afterwards to say, why didn't you come along? And they said, oh, we didn't think it would be the real Roy Williams because Lenny Herd was top of the bill.
The problems of promotion.
I think what's been said just now, and I agree with all of it. And of course, elite players will help other players improve, but you've got to have other players there to be improved.
Yeah.
All forms of art need their grassroots. All forms. People playing more or less for their own amusement, and people who are willing to come and follow it and put a bit of effort into helping things like venues and festivals to run. So, yes, encourage them to come, but without good grassroots, there's a big problem.
Dickie, you had something you were going to say. Do you remember?
Well, it was a while back, but just...
Yeah, sorry. I see you doing this.
Is he still here?
He is.
Are you going there?
In body, anyway. I I do a bit of teaching at Dollar Academy, and they're teaching saxophone, and it's jazz saxophone, and they, you know, they get enough enough students to fill up one day, and that's a good sign. And I'd just like to put in a wee word for the Associated Board and the and Trinity. They put in, you know, they have their jazz syllabus, and to get through that syllabus, these guys and gals have to play. They have to improvise. No, it's not. You know, it's not New Orleans kind of. You know, it's not George Lewis. In fact, I'm not sure how far you'd get if you played like George Lewis in grade 3. But but it's a good sign that there is this thing still going on, and it's supported by the Associated Board and Trinity.
Yeah, and I think this band should perform. I agree with what Dan said earlier. I think we should get a gig. We should do something like that.
With Nori on the decks.
Yeah.
78 RPM decks.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's been a really enlightening conversation. So everybody say bye.
Bye from Celebrity Squares.
Through the square window.
What a bunch of squares, indeed.